Yeah, cool with that. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Breaking Point Podcast UK. Today we are here with Stu Graham. Stu is a health coach and founder of S25 Coaching, which is his own personal coaching company, I guess. I'm not sure what you'd call it. And also the host of the Seeking Insights podcast, which is really cool. You've done loads of episodes, haven't you? So we'll definitely get into that at some point. How are you doing, Stu? How are you doing on this sunny Wednesday? Although maybe it isn't sunny where you are because we don't sound the same.
I live in Gibraltar, so it is quite sunny. I can't complain at the weather here, I have to say. But I'm doing pretty well, thank you. Very excited to get stuck into conversation about all things health and well-being and wherever the conversation takes us for sure. So very excited.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is the first time I've ever had a health coach on, so to speak. So what is a health coach? What does that term mean, in your opinion?
I think it's really tough because what we commonly see as health probably isn't the best description of it. And the reason I say that is because if you come into the health and fitness space like I am in right now, you will see a lot of people who look a very particular way, and there's a lot of ideals that sit within that aren't necessarily aligned with this idea of complete health. So we can see people who are potentially very lean, they've got low levels of body fat, and we might be, those people are physically healthy. But if we start to look at the other facets of health that might include mental well-being, emotional well-being, things like the quality of our relationships, social connections, then all of a sudden that person may not be as quote-unquote healthy as they maybe appear. So for me, health looks like these multiple different dimensions of health that make up a complete life. So it's not just physical, it's not just exercise and food, it's looking at things like emotional well-being, things like emotional intelligence. Can we accurately describe how we feel in the moment? Can we convey that to other people? What's the quality of our relationships like? Can we go out and socialize without things like the food choices or the way that we look negatively impacting those? Because it's much more complex than just physical. I think it becomes really easy to just be like, health is this particular look, or it is this particular body fat percentage, or this particular BMI, when in fact it's far from that, and there is these multiple different parts to it.
Would you say that they're all connected and that you can improve one by improving other, and also conversely, when one starts to waver, can they all sort of waver as a result? Or would you say they're very much separate entities that we have to cultivate separately?
I believe they are interconnected. Don't get me wrong, I feel you can prioritize certain ones more than others. I don't think, because we talk about this idea of balance, right? And I just think balance is a bit of a sticky subject to navigate, because it's not going to be possible depending on where you are in your circumstances and the life that you live. Like, our lives are so dynamic that you're probably not going to be able to find this quote-unquote perfect balance. But what you will find is you'll be able to prioritize certain areas depending on your goals and what you're wanting to achieve. You know, they are interconnected, because if we look at something like your social relationships, a lot of people who come to me, they want to lose body fat, completely valid goal. They're like, actually, I am uncomfortable in my body. This is something that will improve my health. Amazing. If they take it to an extreme where they are no longer eating out, where they're not socializing with friends, their social connection and their relationships take an impact. But then when we actually look at what's underlying the goal of fat loss, it is to potentially, for some people, to feel more accepted, to be able to feel confident to go out and socialize and feel great in their own skin. But then the method that they're using to get there is literally counterproductive to the thing that they're trying to achieve. So they are interconnected, and how you feel on a day-to-day basis is going to impact your ability to engage in the behaviours that impact the other pillars. So, for example, if you're not sleeping great, which you could argue comes under physical health or vitality, if you're not sleeping great, if you aren't getting enough nutrients, you're not nourishing your body, if you're really low on energy, how easy is it going to be to go out and socialize with friends? How easy is it going to be to take actions that do prioritize your mental health and mental well-being, like getting out for a walk? It becomes much harder because of that one pillar. So they are all interconnected. They do all intertwine for sure.
Yeah, because you were speaking about if it starts to impede your social life. That's one of the, is it the DSM-5, which is like the big psychological sort of database on mental illness? One of the signs that you are suffering, maybe from an addiction, which you could kind of interchange with obsession to some degree, maybe, especially nowadays. They've conflated a bit. Obsessions can become addictions. One of the hallmarks in order to be diagnosed with an addiction is it impacting your social life? So do you get that a lot? Do you get people going from, well, yeah, your bio says yo-yo dieting, isn't it? So and I don't really know what that means exactly, but I imagine what it means is you go from one extreme to the other. So do you get that a lot? People going from almost binge eating to basically eating nothing, and they purge, and then they are incredibly strict, and then they purge again. Is that quite a common thing nowadays?
I'm very aware of my scope of practice, so I am unable to, because I'm not a dietitian and I don't have any therapeutic background in like formal training sense. So people with diagnosable eating disorders are well outside of my scope of practice.
Okay.
So when we start to see, and again, the criteria required to diagnose someone as an eating disorder within the DSM-5 is very specific.
Yes.
So what that then creates is this spectrum of relationship with food, you could call it, just our connection with food. And on one side are these quite healthful behaviours, and on the other side would be really maladaptive behaviours. The further down that spectrum you go, the closer you are moving to eating disorder territory. Now, things like purging are really quite far down that maladaptive side. Yeah. So as soon as those behaviours start to be discussed or spoken about or appear, that is where I would start to refer people out to people who are much more well-trained in that domain. But yo-yo dieting as a concept is this idea where someone loses body fat, they maybe maintain it for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, and then they find that they regain it and the cycle repeats. Now, what you described, this idea of like not eating as much and then overeating on a less intense, in a less intense domain or further up the spectrum towards more healthful behaviours, that is really common.
Yeah.
And it's actually one of the things that I see people do the most. And as an example, this might look like being really quote unquote good from Monday to Friday and then overeating massively on a weekend. Or it might be stepping on the scales on a Monday, seeing that their scale weight has gone up, which might be a natural occurrence from what they've consumed at the weekend. It's not necessarily bad or means that they've lost progress. And because of that number going up, they then try and starve themselves, forcibly trying to reduce how much they're eating to get the number lower. And because one of the key drivers of overeating is actually undereating, people find that when they restrict, when they cut out food groups, when they remove entire food groups, like I will not eat carbs, for example, the cravings, the amount that they desire that food naturally increases to the point where they eat it, and then something known as the abstinence violation effect kicks in, and it's actually quite a similar concept from what you mentioned earlier, like addiction areas. And that is, we create a rule. When we break the rule, in our heads we say, well, I've broken the rule now, so I may as well continue.
Might as well go.
So this is this kind of, or one potential driver of, I say I'm not going to eat donuts. When I do eat a donut, I think, well, I've messed up now, so I might as well eat the pack.
Yeah.
And then that cycle repeats, because after they've ate the food that they've deemed off limits, we get a lot of emotions from various different places, but a lot of them are to do with societal expectations or our beliefs around food. And that could be guilt. I shouldn't have done that thing. Or that could be shame to a more extreme extent. I'm a bad person because I did that thing. And then that perpetuates the cycle as well. So people find themselves going up and down in scale weight or never being able to make any meaningful progress. And then when they do, they just revert back to old behaviours, for example.
Yeah, I can imagine that yo-yo dieting could become an addiction in itself, because it's kind of the perfect recipe for an addictive enterprise, in the way that, because the negative aspects of addiction almost maintain the addiction just as much as the positive aspects, don't they? So you kind of have the self pride of not eating unhealthily, and then you have the shame of eating unhealthily, and then that sort of cycle, just as you use the word perpetuate, that cycle just perpetuates itself, because it's an incredibly addictive what would you say, sort of sphere of sensations that a lot of addictions are rooted in, and that's obviously a very powerful driving factor. So how do you stop yo-yo dieting then? What's the answer?
I wish there was this really simple answer that's just like, do X, Y, Z. And it all comes down to these really sort of nuanced discussions of it depends. Like, it depends on the person and what they're particularly struggling with. There are a lot of drivers to these behaviours, and I think that's why it is so hard. There's this sort of, if you look on social media, you will see a lot of people that are like, fat loss is easy, it's just a calorie deficit, and we've heard that hundreds of times. The problem is the implementation of the things that are required to achieve that is much harder. And when we look at maintaining change, first of all, most people's idea of maintenance is mostly wrong. So they think that they're going to lose body fat and then maintain that level of body weight. For example, they want to be 70 kilos. They think that they're going to maintain 70 kilos exactly. And if they don't, they've failed. Where in reality, weight maintenance is a much wider range, and it's going to fluctuate based on where you are in your life. And a lot of the behaviours that we engage in can be unhelpful. So then that leads us to continue that. For example, emotional eating is a really challenging behaviour to navigate.
Yeah.
We all turn to it at some point or another, or a lot of people do, and they feel the experience of that. Emotional eating in itself isn't inherently bad. It's just a soothing mechanism that we use in the moment to help us navigate challenges. The problem starts when that is our sole soothing mechanism and we have no other tools in our toolbox to turn to. So then people turn to food a lot more often. So emotional eating isn't necessarily bad. It's just, it can be unhelpful in some circumstances. And that's just emotional eating. Like when we start to look at things like body image, which is the way that we perceive ourselves, that can be a huge driver of particular behaviours. Like I mentioned the scales earlier. So associating your worth as a human to a number on the scales is a component of body image. Now, if you stand on those scales and they go up and you tell yourself the story that that means you're a bad person or you've in some way failed, then the behaviours that come out the back of that might be restricting, that lead to overeating, you might be skipping meals, it might be these really compensatory behaviours like trying to exercise more. Those can be a driver. We've got relationship with food, which I mentioned. Like if you perceive food as good or bad, as if it has some sort of morality, then that can be a driver. So you eat a food you've labelled as bad, you feel the guilt and the shame, that perpetuates. And then we've got the more, I don't really like the word mindset, but mindset-based concept, such as all or nothing thinking, which is this idea that we only have binary options available to us. We're either a success or we're a failure. Food is either good or bad. We're either all in or we're all out. We don't have this ability to moderate and find almost like a middle path. And that all or nothing thinking can be a huge driver as well. It keeps us trapped in this, well, I haven't lost any weight this week, so I've failed. When in fact, there's been progress in many other areas of health, well-being, the way that someone feels.
Because I think there's a pretty, I mean, I don't know for certain, so don't sort of quote me, but I think there's a pretty damning report when it comes to weight loss that most people that lose weight will inevitably end up putting it back on again. And the reason, or at least that there was a statistic, maybe that, you can't trust everything nowadays, obviously, but navigating weight loss, a family member of mine is part of a sort of big, what would you say? Well, not part of, but she's going to, she's doing Slimming World. Fuck it, you can say the name, who cares? And she comes back and she goes, oh yeah, this week, they do the sin thing where they track how many sins. And originally when she explained the process, I thought, well, this is ridiculous. Surely you should just get people on a diet of chicken and rice and go, off you go, eat that, and then come back and you'll lose the weight really quickly. And then it took me a while to realize actually, the thing about losing weight is that a diet has to be sustainable, otherwise it will fail. Because if you can, depending on someone's willpower, I guess, you can force them to eat a diet that is going to be conducive to consistent weight loss, but it sort of the inevitable will be that it will fail and they will regress back to their old patterns of eating. So what you need to do is you need to create a sort of paradigm shift where they can basically not even realize that they don't eat the way they used to anymore, but they are eating in a different manner, that and in a way that is conducive to weight loss, and that must be quite a difficult thing to manage, because the psychological, as you said, the psychological impacts of eating are such a powerful drive for us. So how do you help people when they say, but the urge is, or something, along the line of, the urge is so strong and it's so ingrained in me, or I love food so much? What would you say to someone that said that to you?
I love food. Huge foodie.
Nice.
I absolutely
good answer, actually.
And the reality is, when I said earlier, it's the restriction that leads to the overeating.
Yes.
It's the same concept here. So people will try and remove a food group and say, like, a particular food, or I'm not going to eat that. And a lot of so something you said there, let's go back to that 95%, I think it's 95% of diets fail is the statistic that gets thrown about. When you look at the methodologies that were used, they are purely food interventions. They are, eat this food, do this, follow this.
Yeah.
There's no depth of change there to behaviour. There's no looking at things like emotional regulation. There's no exploration of someone's beliefs, perceptions around food, exercise, and there's no looking at anything to do with moving someone's motivations from extrinsically driven to intrinsically driven. None of that's covered. It's solely food. So when we look at the study and it says X% of diets fail, well, yeah, because the approach that they took wasn't one that was conducive to longer term change.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that someone can make change and guarantee that change will last, because I can't predict the future.
Yeah.
If we look at an event like COVID, our lives changed so much effectively overnight, there was no way that people could have prepared themselves for that to happen. So what tends to happen is we had all our coping mechanisms for our lives taken away from us. Couldn't go outside for certain amounts of time, couldn't go to the gym, access to food was potentially limited. We had family members getting taken away, isolated from us. We weren't allowed to see friends. In those circumstances, a lot of people turned to coping mechanisms like food and alcohol. Of course they did. That's a completely understandable response in those circumstances. So we can't say, well, you can lose this weight and keep it off forever, because I can't predict what's coming around the next corner. But what we can do is equip people with the tools and skills to navigate those circumstances in the best way that they possibly can, and also have the self-compassion and the understanding to know that they are human, they are limited in some way. We aren't these superheroes that can do it all. It's just not possible. We are limited, we are fallible, we do make mistakes, and having the compassion to know that that could happen and also be able to take the action to make change when we feel that we're able to do so. So that tends to be one of the key drivers of why most diets fail, because that in itself is a lot of work. It's not follow this meal plan of chicken and rice for 6 weeks. It's, you need to build some self-awareness. We need to look at your emotional and your like soothing mechanisms. We need to start looking at what are your motivators, why are you doing this? Can we make those more intrinsically driven? What are your values and how do these behaviours align with those? So now when it comes to looking at food as like this sole thing, I've got urges to eat whatever chocolate, donuts, cake, whatever that food is. They tend to be really common ones. It's like, right, let's check in. Let's create this little mindful moment. Again, it's not an overnight change. It's something that does take time. Can we create a mindful moment where we check in? How do we feel? Is this choice the most helpful in the moment right now? It might be, and that's the truth of it. And one of the big things I say is the people that I work with have unconditional permission to eat. They don't need my permission. They can have whatever they choose because they're adults. And unconditional permission to eat says there are no foods that are off limits. However, there are some foods that will make you personally feel better over a longer period of time, and there are also consequences to your actions. So if you choose the cake, you can have the cake, but you also need to understand that that will have a consequence of some type, whether that is to your longer term goals, because eating cake once isn't going to cause an issue. It's when you do it to the point where it's overconsumption. The food itself isn't bad. It just has less nutrients than a different food. So when we drop this morality, when we drop this aspect of good and bad, I shouldn't be eating such and such, then all of a sudden we've got this freedom of choice. It gives us back our autonomy because we're not listening to all this external noise of what we should and shouldn't eat. The only foods that you're obviously not going to eat are ones that you're allergic to or intolerant to. And some people still choose to do that, and that's entirely their choice. But when we look at this sort of idea of, well, actually, I can eat whatever I want, we've now got freedom. We can now say, what do I want to eat? And when we look at this idea of it, it's known as a body food choice congruence. And it's what I said earlier, it's this idea of what also makes me feel good, what makes me feel great and energized and allows me to live my life in the way that I want to, and also factors in my health and well-being and what is most important to me via my values. So this process of going, well, actually the cake in that option, if you get to sit down and socialize with a friend over a coffee and a cake, and it's a really deep and meaningful conversation, is that cake still bad? Well, no, because that could be facilitating health in another domain, social health, because we can't, in circumstances where people talk about like addiction and food addiction, alcohol isn't a requirement for us to survive. Food is.
Yeah.
We need to eat food or we don't survive. So the dynamic's completely different with it.
Yeah.
And it's not that we're addicted to food, it's often we're addicted to, or we enjoy the feelings that we get from it. So when we start looking at this more holistic view of food and of health, it allows us to include all the foods that we enjoy, but it also means that we make choices that we know the future version of us is going to thank us for, because that's compassion. Compassion says, I'm going to do the thing that's helpful for the future version of me. So that might be the version of you this afternoon, tomorrow, next week, next month, next decade. And when we look at values and what's most important, for example, a lot of people have families or they have their careers or relationships. How can you continue to live your life in alignment with that value? Well, if you've got kids, you want to see your kids grow up. You want to be able to walk your daughter down the aisle. You want to play with them in the park. You want to be able to do all of these things. That's really important to you. Great. Health facilitates you to live that value. Health becomes this sort of umbrella over everything else that we do. Ask any person who doesn't have their health what they want the most of. Health.
Yeah.
It's this thing that we often take for granted and completely neglect, but it stops us from living the life that we truly want to live. So it's like, right, can we put some emphasis there and this complete version of health, not just physical health. And then all of a sudden, food can meet emotional needs, it can meet social needs, it can give us that moment of respite from a really tough situation. But we also have this diverse range of soothing mechanisms that mean we don't just rely on food, and we can start to make choices that align with where we want to go to and what's actually helpful for our longer term lives, as well as the in the moment choices that make us feel great. Because like I say, I love food, I love eating out, I love going to restaurants and trying new things. Like, that's a huge part of my life. It's a huge part of my relationship with my partner. So if I just said I'm not going to eat out anymore, how would that negatively impact my life? And I imagine it would be quite a big way.
Yeah. In many aspects of life, the sort of future projection is quite a flawed exercise. But just what you were saying there, when it comes to health, it's actually not very flawed. So if you said to someone, you could eat this cake now, and the sort of the two options, the two outcomes are, you don't eat the cake and you don't get the pleasure, or you do eat the cake and you do get the pleasure. If you look at it from that limited time frame, people will say, well, okay, I'll just eat the cake then, because that's the better outcome when you look at it from that. But then if you scale it out and you say, well, in 3 years' time, you don't eat the cake now, you're contributing possibly to a healthier version of you. And if you do eat the cake, then you're contributing to a slightly less healthy version of you. But then that is also flawed, because, as you said, if once people become their own tyrant when it comes to food, it becomes pathological, and then it becomes a greater problem possibly than it originally was. So huge aspects of life are balancing up. Is this, because eliminating the pleasure of life is, human beings are stuck with sort of the perennial choice of, do I sacrifice the present for the future? And we're continuously battling with that, and we sort of prioritize in what aspects we should sacrifice the present for the future. And maybe in sort of a career end, it probably is better to sacrifice the present for the future, because the possible growth is great. But then maybe certainly with health, it's definitely better to sacrifice the present for the future. But then there's other aspects where it's like, well, what do I do here? So I guess what you said there is incredibly important. It's about discerning and deciphering out, when is it okay to just say, because an element of, fuck it, is a vital aspect of life. You had to be able to have that sort of apathetic, I'll do what I want attitude. You do need that, because the tyrant that some people have in them more than others will take a grip of you if you don't keep a hold of it. That from a sort of psychological perspective, I think Freud called it the super ego, which is like this incredibly judgmental voice that we all have inside of us. And then at the bottom there was the id, which is basically, so when people are yo-yo dieting, what they're basically doing is they're jumping from these two extremities, and then the ego, which is in the middle, is kind of sort of in chaos, going, I don't know how to control these two because they're so powerful, and they're flip-flopping back and forth and grabbing hold of the reins, so to speak. So it is, and you are spot on, because with alcohol you can tell someone, in a dream world, an ideal world, it's just, stop drinking. That's it. You don't need to drink. You don't need to drink alcohol. There's plenty of lovely plenty of lovely drinks out there that you can drink instead of alcohol. And there are people that do that. They never reach the point of addiction of alcoholism, which once you reach that point, it's a different ball game entirely, unfortunately. And they just don't drink anymore, and they're perfectly happy. But food isn't like that. Food is, as you said, we have a congenital and everlasting sort of necessity of food, and we have to navigate that. And which is why, what you're doing probably should have more sort of attention that it's getting, actually, because, food is such a a key aspect of our lives. And one other thing, I know I've spoken a lot, but you were speaking about the layer, or you were sort of alluding to the idea of the layers of the of who we are, and how if you just target the surface layer, you're not going to make any difference. And I had a sort of skin consultation thing the other day, very random, just came to me while you were talking, and the guy was talking about how there are so many layers of skin. There's like the epidermis, which is like what we see. Then there's a dermis, and like usual sort of anti-acne products that you can get from like Boots or something. They can only target the top layer, or maybe 2 layers, I'm not sure. But there are like loads more layers underneath, and this is kind of what the I think you used the word intervention dieting. I can imagine that what they are is they can only target the top 2 layers of the I don't know, diet psyche or whatever, so to speak, or just the psyche of who you are in general. But there needs to be a holistic and in-depth paradigmal shift of who you are as a person, because I think there are some sort of statistics, or maybe not statistics, but outward thinking of like people that have had trauma and stuff, they can hold on to weight slightly more because as a form of sort of protection. And I watched a documentary on Netflix the other day, and they were analyzing the gut microbiome of different people, and they basically said that they found this woman that was, relatively overweight, and they said, you are very low in this type of bacteria, and that is possibly contributing to why you can't lose weight as easy as some other people. So there's just so many things going on with like everything that we know very, very little about. And I'm going to stop talking now because that was long. But yeah, it's such a great topic and area of interest that you're talking about, and you clearly really know what I can see why you're have lots and lots of good testimonials, because you definitely know what you're talking about, and I would come to you for coaching. So yeah, it's a great topic. The podcast isn't ending, by the way. I don't know why I said it like that.
Oh, the podcast has ended, did you say?
No, the podcast hasn't ended. It just sounded like I was
going to say, I've still got more to say. But I think one thing that we commented on there, that you definitely commented on, was this idea of going deep. Yeah. And there are genuinely some people out there that don't need to. They will show up, make some changes, and they'll be fine. But then there's also the other extreme of people who do need to do this work.
Yeah.
And I think a huge factor of that is how long you've been exposed to something like diet culture for. How long, like I've worked with women more particularly. Yeah. And I was literally having a conversation with someone who I'm working with at the moment. And she is in her 40s. And the word she said is, this is the first time I don't feel like I've been on a diet since I was 13. So that's like 30 years of trying to change, attack, shame her body because of society's standards.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because she thought there was anything wrong with her. And this is where we see diet culture that says thinner is better. If you look in any sort of, especially marketing that uses pain points, it makes out as if people who are in larger bodies are in some way less worthy. It makes out as if they're lazy. It makes out as if they don't have willpower.
Yeah.
It's like, none of that's true. Like, that's all false. That's just us saying that someone in a certain body has certain characteristic traits, which are so far from the truth. And when we actually look at the impact of, right, it's coming up to summer, right? Next time you go on Instagram and you're starting scrolling through, how many posts are saying, are you summer body ready? Are you ready to hit the beach? Become your best self this summer by dieting. Sorry, I didn't realise that there was a particular body shape for summer. I didn't realise I needed to look a certain way to go and step on the beach. And I didn't realise that the only way to improve or grow myself was to lose body fat.
Yeah.
Like, there's these underlying narratives, and now wind it back to Kate Moss. Nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. was a quote that came directly from her. Look at mainstream media, and you've got regular people being shamed for their bodies changing. There was posts in like tabloid newspapers that were like the 20 worst beach bodies. This is rife in our society of us judging people by the way that they look.
Yeah.
By saying, even down in day-to-day conversations with family members, how, such and such has gained weight. Why does that matter? Why has that got anything to do with you? It doesn't. And like, you look so well because someone's lost weight. And this comes back to the health conversation, right? Like, I have had a conversation with someone very recently whose relative was chronically ill, very, very ill. But people kept telling her, wow, you look amazing, because she'd lost weight, when actually she was the most unhealthy that she'd ever been because of her chronic illness. And it's now looking at this and saying, this idea we have of health, this picture we have of health is just so completely wrong. Diet culture does enforce that. And a lot of people may see me as like, you're anti-diet. I'm not pro-diet or anti-diet. I'm about the person. Like, what do you want? What is best for you? And what is the best route that we can take to get you to where you want to go? For some people, that is going to look like fat loss because it's going to improve their overall health and well-being. For other people, it's going to look like doing this mindset work to change our perception of ourselves and remove the focus away from how we look and towards all the other amazing things our bodies allow us to do. Like, body functionality is a huge thing. And for anyone listening, this is like one of the quickest ways to impact how you feel about yourself. Start writing down ways that your body allows you to do things that have got nothing to do with the way that you look. How you feel on like the feelings, or I can feel love, I can experience joy, I can play around with my kids, I can go for a run, I can go to the gym and lift weights. My body allows me to digest food and survive. It beats my heart for me. Like, I don't need to think about beating my own heart or running all of these super complex functions. It does it for me. Like, our bodies serve purposes so far outside of just how they look. So if we can start to tune into that, all these things that our body allows us to do, the functionality of them, it can start to detract away from this solely aesthetic aspect, and it can start to help us find this appreciation for our bodies outside of how they look. And when we can start to find that, when we can start to accept our bodies for the way that they are, acceptance doesn't mean blind resignation. It just means taking stock. Like, this is what my body allows me to do. These are all the positives. Like, once we do that, then we can start to find a much more calm, curious, so that we're embracing this curiosity, connected version to change. Because we're not trying to like shame ourselves into change. Shame doesn't work. It's not an effective motivator for change. It might work short term, but it certainly doesn't long.
It's incredibly corrosive, shame. Anyone that is using shame to get you to do something, or to encourage you, or to manipulate/adapt your opinion of anything is someone you should stay away from, because they have insidious intentions, or even if they don't realize it, they're not utilizing beneficial in the long, beneficial developments in the long run, I suppose. It's interesting that you bring up women, because I was kind of going to ask you on that, because I can imagine that a lot of your coaches are women, possibly because of, I was thinking about this as you were talking, every single like women / young women, because obviously we're not that old, that I've like properly known has had some form of eating disorder at some form in their life. And I think the statistics, obviously this is out of both of our remits, but the statistics when it comes to young men and young women, when it comes to eating disorders, are shocking. Like, young women are so far more likely to develop some form of eating disorder than young men, particularly the I don't know if it's the nerviosis, but the anorexia and the bulimia, and it's because women. Well, I imagine it's, as you've already said, but women are judged far more on their physical appearance than men are in society, and they also judge themselves a lot on their. So that there's a study that showed that young women, it's actually women want, if this is the societal sort of bracket I find very interesting, because there was a study that showed that young women would rather be thinner than young men sort of think they should be. So if people say that there's a societal pressure or a pressure from men on women, I don't think that is quite the case. It's, in my experience, there's something about being thin and that women sort of have this affiliation with, and it's probably got sort of reproductive benefits, but it's just and obviously there's a societal aspect to that, but navigating that world as you go through it must be so complicated and so difficult for them to go through. So I can imagine why it unfortunately often ends up in some form of maladaptive behavior, development of maladaptive behaviors, because it's just a whirlwind of complexity. And social media and Instagram, all this goes into it. So do you get people that use social media? You've kind of mentioned it briefly, but do you get people that say social media has really impacted me when it comes to my body, body perception? Is that something that comes up?
Yeah. So just to circle back on something you mentioned there, because I think it's so important, and this sort of way that we talk about ourselves, or for a very long time, wrongly, I'll start by saying that women have been objectified by men.
Yeah,
still goes on now, and that is all aspects of their humanity removed, aside from how they look.
Yeah,
treated like objects to be, in whatever way, to be glamoured over. And if we look back to, I can't remember the dates, but if you look back to things like, I want to say like the 1800s, like corsets were getting introduced then, so that women would change their bodies for the male gaze.
Yeah.
Now that, the patriarchy to an extent had a huge impact on that. That is we can prove that throughout research, that actually the patriarchy and men objectifying women is a huge problem, and has been a huge problem, and continues to be a problem. But there is the aspect of self-objectification as well. And we're seeing this more and more with social media. And this is how this all intertwines. Self-objectification is treating ourselves like objects and just seeing ourselves as how we look, and forgetting all of those other dimensions of our personality, of our identity, aside from appearance.
Yeah.
Now this, what you mentioned there about the eating disorder prevalence in women compared to men, there's a few factors here. One of them is just the fact that when we look at the research, it's mainly women. Men aren't being... So there are actually men struggling with eating disorders. Just the likelihood that they come forward is less, because they see that as very shameful, as a direct sort of pushback on their masculinity, for example. We've got little research into the areas of men and eating disorders. There's not a great deal there. And also some of the diagnoses criteria for eating disorders don't factor in for muscularity, for example. So what you said there was about women trying to move towards thinness, but there can be a whole host of maladaptive behaviours of men that are trying to get towards muscularity, but we haven't factored that into the criteria. So I had a guy called George on my podcast, and he was talking all about this and how we're trying to diversify that criteria to include muscularity, Because the problem is that we can be engaging in these behaviours that are robbing from our overall health and well-being for the other reason, to gain size, because a lot of the values of the health and fitness space as a whole, things like discipline, things like being strong, being powerful, being dominant, also happen to be a lot of the traditional masculine ideals.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of interlace there. So when we start to look at it from that perspective, a lot more men struggle with body image issues and struggle with disordered eating behaviours and potentially eating disorders. It's just much less prevalent within the research. So that is just something to consider there. But then when we look at this objectification, we're now seeing men being objectified. It's been happening for a long time, and this isn't a whataboutism. It isn't saying that it isn't happening to women. It absolutely has, and it has done for a very long time. Just we're starting to see that swing the other way as well. And a lot of men are being objectified. For example, there was a news headline, the 10 best bulges at the Olympics or something like that, at the divers, where they were just showing photos of these men's cocks in their briefs. And it's like, that is objectification, but that's encouraged. In the same way that objectification has been for so long for women previously, it isn't us versus them, it's let's work together to solve this collective problem. Now, social media amplifies all that to an enormous extent, because all we're seeing are snapshots of people's lives. And, oh my God, like, she's so, like, this influencer culture where trends are being set to look a certain way, to have certain procedures done, to be a certain amount muscular. You know, we're seeing trends of, like, reality TV shows that a lot of the people all seem to very much look the same. So these are driving the new sets of ideals. And we've got some really great emerging research to say that things like fitspo content, like fitness inspiration content, where people post a photo of themselves like shredded with sweat dripping down them, lifting, is having a negative impact on body image and the way that people perceive themselves, rather than it being inspirational like people think it is. So when you go onto your fitness feed, onto your Instagram feed, and all you see is fitness content, all of a sudden you're comparing yourself to these ideals all of the time, consciously or subconsciously, and that can have a detrimental impact. So again, with the people I work with, a lot of people do say, yes, social media is having an impact on me. And the first step of that is to sort through, start removing people who don't genuinely add to your life or muting them, and start to diversify what you see in your other interests. You love dogs, great, follow a few dog pages. You like interior design, great, follow that. You like cars, go and follow a load of car pages. Diversify your feed so you're not just seeing fitness content, which is arguably a huge problem I have, because I'm in the fitness space. Every so often, all I'm seeing every post is fitness, 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 and it gets me. It impacts me negative. I can feel it. So every so often, I have to go onto my explore page, type in dogs, and just go and like loads of dog photos to bring back some more wholesome content into my grid, into my explore page. Because if I don't, I'm exposed to that. And the longer that I'm in there, the more I'm starting to see these really outlandish parts of the fitness space that are very extreme and promote really, really quite troubling behaviours. Like, there's a lot out there that can be so damaging. And whether it's because people don't know better, which I think they do, I just don't think taking the more nuanced and holistic approach pays the bills, because they're financially incentivized to use transformation photos, for example. So side-by-side photos don't help people's body image. So if your goal is to help people make long-term change, using side-by-side photos isn't actually all that helpful, because it's negatively impacting someone's body image, which is a driver of behavior further down the line. So we've got some great research to support that now, but people still use them, and they claim to be evidence-based. It can't be both. You're either evidence-based or you're choosing to go down that route. Now, I've got no judgment. They can do what they want, but you can't make that claim because we've got evidence to support otherwise. So and again, their business operates on that, and that's the standard that we've created. But if we also want a better space, we need to start making these changes. So in a very long roundabout way, yes, social media does have an impact, and the objectification of ourselves and of other people is also having an enormous impact.
And it's growing, isn't it? Yeah. Well, it's just as you were speaking there. Do you remember the fitness DVDs, particularly aimed at like middle-aged women, like Colleen Nolan, for Fat to Flat in 4 weeks? And what they do is they get a before photo, they stick her on a juice cleanse for 3 weeks. They film her doing the exercises, doesn't actually do them, and then they get her to ship her off to a beach somewhere, take a few photos of her, put an article out in the Sun, and then get the publicity, and then they sell a DVD for however long, and then it's complete and utter fallacy and fraudulent. And with the birth of social media, like that phenomenon is possible of happening at a tenfold degree, because people what am I trying to say? Instagram adverts, and you can get these things out there incredibly easily, and it can be so corrosive and damaging. And as you said, it's the monetary gain, isn't it? And that's the problem with. That's a different topic, to be fair. But yes, you're spot on. But one thing you've already touched on it, I find quite interesting, is you use the term of how the sort of the feminine expectation from moving towards thinness, and then the male expectation of moving towards muscularity. It's another example. With the sort of the woman end of the spectrum, it's considered sort of a societal expectation or expectation placed on them by men, but it's not considered an expectation placed on men by women when it comes to muscularity. Maybe it's because it's a more new sort of phenomenon, and therefore we haven't reached that conclusion yet. But just the way that you described it with the differing polarities and how they're mirror images of each other to some degree, I thought that was very interesting, because you are right, there is Love Island. I mean, I think Love Island, I'm like, how do these things still exist? And they keep making more of them as well. It's not like they're stuck with one. There's like every few weeks you see a new iteration advertised, and it just sort of baffles my mind how these things, and that's obviously because they get views, and they turn heads, and they appeal to the lowest common denominator, which is drama and sort of stereotypically attractive people, and that's what we're seeing. And it's a shame, but yeah, the Love Island generation that we're kind of part of it's an interesting one. It's an unprecedented experience, I think. I mean, maybe not, but yeah. What do you think? What's your opinion on like Love Island and those sorts of reality TV experiences or programs in relation to health and well-being, both physically and mentally?
I think a huge part comes to what you said, and it's these sort of ideals and standards and expectations. I think if we were far more clear about, all the shows were much more diversified, there wouldn't be as much of an issue. I think everyone's entitled to watch them. Like, if you want to watch them, crack on. Like, that's entirely your choice. But I think just being able to add this lens of, well, actually, this probably isn't a representation of people. This is just a very specific sample that they've picked that look a very specific way. I think being able to have that critical thinking lens really does help. And it's like these things are going to be produced until enough people say, well, hold on, this isn't quite right. I mean, we've seen a huge impact on the people who are in there and their mental health and well-being, and the impact that being in the spotlight has on people, because, again, they're dehumanized.
Yeah.
These people are treated like they're not humans anymore, like they don't have feelings, like they don't have emotions, like they can't make mistakes because they're put on pedestals. And is there some shitty behaviour goes on? Absolutely. But then again, they are still human. They're going to make mistakes. So I think being able to bring that really a bit of a compassionate lens to it, and be like, they are human, they will make mistakes. Understand that the circumstances that they are under are very different to the ones in real life.
Yeah.
Understand that it's perpetuating a lot of expectations that from society that maybe don't apply to you or you don't want to listen to. That say you must look this way, act this way, talk this way, appear this way, eat, drink, train, whatever it is. Can we start to filter those away? And yeah, absolutely, tune in and enjoy it for the sake of enjoying it. Like, enjoy it for the pleasure, but just bring that level of like realism to it. Be like, right, this probably isn't an accurate representation of reality. I don't need to hold myself to these standards, because it is just like what I said, that objectification of people. And are they going to be problematic? I would imagine so at some point, but there's been lots of other things that are too. And just to double back on what you said about the muscularity side of things, I don't know how much of the need to be more muscular is coming from other drivers other than things like status, other than things like the dominance and the power, and to feel as though the person is more of a man. I think that is a lot of a driver in there as well. I think that we're in this real strange place right now where we've got this crisis of masculinity, where men don't really understand how they fit into the world anymore, because all the dynamics have changed for the better. Again, it's not an us versus them. We've seen a lot of women get more power. And again, I understand we're having a very gendered debate here, or a very gendered discussion, sorry.
Yeah.
But men are now at this stage where they're like, right, well, actually, how do we fit into the world? All these expectations that we had placed on us don't really fit anymore. We're getting told that certain aspects of masculinity are quote-unquote toxic. Don't like the word. They're just unhelpful aspects of masculinity. There's a lot of polarization in the media. There's a lot of pushback on men to do better. But then there's also people trying to force men into other boxes rather than support them to find out who they want to be and how they can impact the world. And we don't really have those. We do have role models for masculinity. There's some really great ones out there, but they don't get the service or the airtime that they deserve. So all of a sudden we've got men who feel a bit lost, who feel a bit confused, who don't really know who they are or how they fit into the world. They don't feel like they've got purpose. They don't feel like they've got direction. And it's no one's fault. It's just, as a society, this is what we've led to. And I think there's a huge component to that fits into, well, if I just get more muscular, it'll solve the problem. My God. And again, the gym is a phenomenal place to learn about yourself, to grow in other domains, not just muscular. It's a phenomenal place to build a community and meet people and get to know people who love doing the same things as you. It can feel therapeutic, but it isn't therapy. Yeah. Therapy is therapy. And we're finding a lot of people turn into that domain to improve their mental health and well-being, which is great. But then, like you said earlier on, these things then become crutches to lean on too often. They become things that people become obsessed with. Like, I need more muscle. I need to build more muscle. If I don't build enough muscle, I'm not as much of a man. I don't feel like I fit in the world. This is my soul. And it gets to the stage where men are starting to struggle with mental health issues, to the point where suicidal ideation, again, there's a lot of people out there who talk about that, the extent of body dysmorphia leading to suicidal ideation just because of lack of muscularity, of not being able to build it enough. And of course, there's multiple confounding variables here. It's not just one thing. And like, I think you mentioned earlier on about how complex it all is, we can relate that to obesity. If you look at, you can type it in on Google, it's like a map of all of the risk factors for obesity, and there's like genetics, there's medical history, there's trauma, there's socio-economic factors, there's where you live, there's what postcode you're growing up on, there's your access to food. The map is massive. It is huge. And it is so complex. There's so many lines and connections, and that's just what we've mapped out. All of these things are so complex, and yes, they are complex. That doesn't mean fat loss isn't achievable. It is. It doesn't mean building muscle in a way that doesn't negatively impact your mental well-being isn't achievable. It is. These things are achievable. We just need to approach them with a little sense of caution, I feel, and be like, right, am I doing this in a way that does? And again, that's why I tend to focus on health as a whole, to try and protect people from that. And I feel like you said there, that might spread over into things like reality TV. Like, actually, is watching this TV program serving you? Do you get anything from it? If you don't, then that's your choice to make, whether you continue. Like, I don't tell my clients what to do. I ask them questions and help them find the answers that are most appropriate for them. But that is like, right, well, is it serving you? What do you get from it? Is what you get from it worth the time that you spend watching it? Is it worth the cons? Make a pros and cons list. What are the pros of watching Love Island? What are the cons of watching Love Island? Which is most important to you? It's like, all right, okay, yeah, that makes more sense now. Because you can see it down on paper. Same as social media. How much do you use social media? Does it benefit you? Can you reduce that? Can you compromise? Can you not watch something as often? Can you only watch the highlights of particular episodes? Can you reduce your social media time? Can you unfollow, change who you follow, so that you're following educators who are putting out this really great content that is nuanced and speaks at your level? Because there's too many people who'll use loads of jargon and they'll talk about things just to confuse you. Like, there's a big one right now about insulin. Like, the insulin model, like if your insulin's too high, you won't lose body fat. Well, that model got disproved so many years ago that they don't really fund any research to disprove it anymore. Like, we've got so much evidence to support they cherry-pick data. And because obviously normal people, I can't really read, well, I can to an extent, but reading research papers is really hard. Yeah. It's a skill that requires building. So it's like, right, can I find some really great evidence-based practitioners that present nuanced answers that can show me how this applies to my life, and the content leaves me feeling inspired, not scared of every food under the sun, not terrified of how I look, not shamed about my body. Like, how does the content make you feel after you've consumed it? Whether that's social media, Instagram, or TV, Love Island, podcasts, whatever it is, how does it make you feel?